Hello everyone. I spotted this book in Waterstones last week and I've just finished reading it. It was only published this year, 2019, but publication had passed me by. I wasn't even aware of it. So I thought I'd do a quick review of it just to give you my impressions of it, because it's a really good read. I can highly recommend it, even if you're not interested in the Crimean War, but you have got an interest in military history. I think this would appeal to you. Robert Kershaw is ex-military. The book is titled 24 Hours at Balaclava, 25th of October 1854, Voices from the Battlefield. Now, what that sort of suggests is that he's used a lot of records and diary accounts and accounts of eyewitnesses and participants in the Battle of Balaclava to form the basis of the book, but also that he goes into it in a very kind of temporal fashion, which indeed he does. I mean, you can see that basically each chapter and each section of the book is broken down into sort of hour segments or even 5-minute segments, as this one was. So it's very much written with a kind of time frame imposed on it, and it does draw on a lot of contemporary eyewitness accounts and so on in order to form the sort of structure of the book. But that doesn't actually limit him. He does describe the onset of the Crimean War and the build-up, the previous Battle of the Alma and the excuse me, and the decision not to pursue the retreating army, Russian army, from after the Battle of the Alma, but to circle round Sevastopol and instigate a formal siege of the city, which was really the prelude to the Battle of Balaclava. What the book reminds me of, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here though, what the book reminds me of, its style. I think he's certainly been influenced by this book, I would say, which is another book that I really admire, which deals just with the charge of the Light Brigade, which was the most famous or infamous element of the Battle of Balaclava, but by no means the only part of the battle. But the charge by Mark Adkin does just deal with the charge of the Light Brigade. Mark Adkin himself was ex-military, so he writes the history in a very similar kind of manner to the way that Robert Kershaw writes. But the other book, which I couldn't help recalling as I was reading this, was a book that probably Robert Kershaw may, be familiar with. It's John Keegan's The Face of Battle. This was published way back in 1976, but really John Keegan set a new trend, as it were, in military history writing, in that he really introduced the aspect of the individual's experience during 3 particular battles in this particular book, Agincourt, Waterloo and the Somme. So it was Keegan who really, I would say, started that fashion of really describing battles from the viewpoint of the soldier or the sailor or whatever on the ground or on the sea. So Robert Kershaw's book certainly does that. It's full of really graphic and vivid descriptions of the personal experiences of a lot of the participants in the battle, what they had to endure, the kind of fighting that they took part in, the type of weapons that they had to face, all that kind of thing, the wounds that they had inflicted on them or inflicted on others. It goes into a lot of detailed description of the fighting in that way, and it's really, really compelling reading. I'm going to show you that Mark Adkin book again in a moment, but what I would say about this book, which I think it lacks, is in the list of contents here. You can see how the book is laid out in terms of this sort of time frame element. So it sticks quite rigidly to that. But there's no list in here of where to find the maps, the illustrations, or the photographs. And when you first start reading this book, this map is on the first or the sort of second page of the book as you go in, and it's I think you can see there, it's a contemporary 19th century map of the siege lines around Sevastopol, and for a long way into the book that is the only map that you come across, and it did begin to worry me that this was all I would have to refer to when I was reading the text, in terms of working out. I was familiar with the layout of the battlefield of Balaclava and so on, and the geography, the topography, but for someone who was coming to it with not a great deal of knowledge of the Crimean War, you know, this would panic you, I think, because it's a very kind of dated layout of the of Sevastopol, and you've got Balaclava harbour here itself, and that this is the area that the Battle of Balaclava was fought on, but it's not a particularly useful map. And in fact, when you get further into the book, you do discover there are some quite excellent maps in here, but it would have been useful to have them, you know, have a list of where to find them here, or even have them all at the beginning or the end of the book, so that, and then refer to them in the text. So I would kind of criticise the book in that respect. Now, I've put quite a lot of markers in here, so there's quite a lot of things that I want to talk about. One of the things you should say near the beginning is that there's been so many books written on the Crimean War and the individual battles in it now that is Robert Kershaw really bringing anything new to the history of it? And I would say yes, he is. This is a really interesting book to read, and I did glean some new kind of insights into the Battle of Balaclava from it. In particular, and this is something that really sparked my attention, is close to the beginning of the book. I think in the introduction or the acknowledgements, he expresses his thanks to a tour company, which I've mentioned on earlier videos, called The Cultural Experience. Now, I'm actually going on holiday next year on a tour organised by The Cultural Experience. It's to Jordan, following in the sort of footsteps of Lawrence of Arabia's campaigns. But some time ago, I did express an interest to them that if they ever organise a trip to the Crimea, I would certainly be interested in going on that. And this leads me to hope that basically Robert Kershaw does occasionally is the guide on some of the cultural experiences, holidays and trips. And I'm hoping that as the cultural experience helped him to visit the Crimea on his own sort of individual trip and organise a local guide for him who he found very helpful, that's a kind of precursor to a more general holiday being organised by the cultural experience. Politically, it's a little bit awkward at the moment because of the political situation in the Crimea, that Russia has regained it from the Ukraine, and in sort of formal kind of political from the political standpoint, Russia has technically seized the Crimea illegally, so organising holidays to it is a little bit problematic at the moment. So hopefully that situation will resolve in some way in the not too distant future, and it'll make it easier for the cultural experience to organise a holiday there. But that was something that I noticed straight away, was that the connection that Robert Kershaw already has as a guide for the cultural experience, plus the fact that he did make his own kind of personal trip to the Crimea, and that is one of the things that he does bring that is fresh to the story of the Battle of Balaclava, that he actually went there at exactly the same time of year in October as the Balaclava battle took place. So he does have a lot of his own photographs in this book, and he's able to make a kind of not only a sort of commentary from his own military experience point of view, but also from standing on the actual places where the battle took place. I mean, for instance, here this is his own photograph of the hillock on which the 93rd Regiment made its stand. They were the Highland Regiment, the famous Thin Red Line, which was actually described by Russell, the Times war correspondent, who viewed the battle from the heights where Raglan was also viewing the battle, as a thin red streak, and that got changed, I think, by the editor of the Times in a later account to the Thin Red Line. But the Thin Red Line was originally the Thin Red Streak. So those are sort of some of the things that Kershaw brings, sort of, which are kind of unique in a way, and worth telling. The stories worth telling from that aspect. While I'm on this page of photographs, this one here, I noticed this is from his own collection as well. So I have never seen this photograph before. It looks to me as though it's a contemporary photograph, because the Crimean War was one of the first wars to be photographed. I suspect it does look very much as though, with the horses outside and so on, that photograph is contemporary. So what it's doing in his collection, I'm not quite sure. But anyway, this is the Bracker farmhouse, which was actually Lord Raglan's HQ. I've never seen this photograph before, but if you remember, some time ago, I painted up a model of a noble nobleman's house from the Polish Wargamer company. There it is. And at the time I said I was going to use it as a model. It's 15mm, so it's slightly the wrong scale for the figures that I'm using to wargame the Crimean War. But I said at the time it struck me as being something that would have appeared in the Crimea, the sort of appearance of some of the houses and farmhouses there, and sure enough, I think if I can get back to that photograph there, you can see that it has got a very similar kind of appearance, with a single story, tiled roof with the chimneys and so on, and these sort of rectangular kind of adjuncts to the building are actually on the main facade, but on this particular building they've got them on the sides. But anyway, I noticed that, found that of interest. One of the reasons why this book did remind me of the Mark Adkin book was that there are several illustrations of how the various charges, the Light Brigade's charge, and this is the Heavy Brigade's charge, how the squadrons were actually lined up, and how the regiments were lined up. And this particular illustration here is strikingly similar to an illustration in Mark Adkin's book, which is the lineup for the Light Brigade. My preference would be for this one. This has got a lot more realistic kind of illustrations of the individuals and the uniforms that they were wearing. But it is exactly the same in terms of the perspective as this one. But if you notice, I don't know if you can see there, but all the individual officers, this is meant to be the Heavy Brigade, are all depicted with bicorns, and in fact most of them would have worn the Albert helmet, including Scarlett himself. There is the helmet that he actually wore at the Battle of Balaclava is in the forget the name of the regiment, but it's in York, in the local regiment's museum in York, to be seen with all the dents from the sabre cuts that it took. I'm really getting this muddled up. Sorry, I meant to do this in a more structured fashion, but I'm leaping from one subject to another without really giving you a kind of detailed account. But in terms of his depictions of the fighting, there were basically three key kind of components to the Battle of Balaclava. One was the Thin Red Line, and the Highland, the 93rd Regiment holding back the Russian cavalry as it descended on Balaclava. The second was the charge of the Heavy Brigade, the so-called charge of the Heavy Brigade, when they were in danger of being attacked in the flank by the same kind of cavalry body that was coming down off of the Causeway Heights, and they were able to sort of wheel and dress their ranks and then charge into this huge body of cavalry, about 2,000 cavalry, and the Heavy Brigade was only about 600 or 700 strong, and cut their way right through them and win this sort of dramatic triumph over the Russian cavalry. And then the third aspect, the third element of the battle, was the charge of the Light Brigade. But in terms of the cut and thrust and so on, Kershaw's very good at describing the different methods of the use of the cavalry sword and the lance, and the way wounds were inflicted and so on, and he does demonstrate or describe quite well that the the steady and kind of professional cavalryman would always use the thrust of the sword with the weight of the horse's kind of momentum behind it in order to pierce the opponent and then inflict a wound that way, which was usually lethal. But the majority of kind of cavalrymen in the heat of the moment would usually sort of cut and slash with their swords, and that is why so many wounds were quite nasty, but they were never not usually lethal. And Scarlett himself, on his helmet, you can see a massive kind of dent in the helmet that he wore at the battle, where a Russian cavalryman had obviously brought a sort of slashing blow down onto his head, and the helmet had been able to deflect it. Kershaw kind of points out that a lot of the heavy brigades swords in particular had lost their edge just in the short period that the war had been going on for. I think they landed in Calamita Bay at the end of September, so they'd only been in the Crimea about a month. But unless they protected the edge of their cutlasses and swords, the edge went quite quickly. One way was to protect the edge by stuffing straw down into the scabbard, but a lot of the cavalry swords were actually quite blunt by the time they got into the battle, and the Russian greatcoats were sufficiently thick to actually stop a lot of the blows inflicting a wound. So the principal way of actually disabling your opponent was to thrust with the point of the sword. And the other thing that he remarks on, which never occurred to me before, was that during that particular fight between the Heavy Brigade and the Russian cavalry, the British horses were much taller than the horses of their Russian opponents, so they had a kind of height advantage. So bringing the sword down onto the Russians' kind of heads and so on was a lot easier than it was for the Russians to do in return. So as I say, that's kind of got me out of sync in terms of the things I wanted to talk about. One of the other things that is often overlooked in accounts of the Battle of Balaclava, or is often portrayed incorrectly, which Kershaw isn't the first person to correct, but he certainly makes a point of doing so, is the participation of the Turks. Let me find one of the maps in here, and I might be able to describe this with a little bit more accuracy for you. That's actually of the charge itself. That will do, but there's a better one than that somewhere. Yeah, here we are. This is slightly smaller. Zoom in on it a little bit, might be able to make it out a bit better. So, this is a map of more or less the entire battlefield of Balaclava, and basically you've got the harbour of Balaclava here. This is the Causeway Heights, with what the road that was known as the Woronzof Road, leading from the sort of interior of the Crimea. I think this goes to Simferopol, which is the capital of the Crimea, and leads along this causeway height and then on to Sevastopol, which the Allies were besieging, which is over about here somewhere. So the causeway heights separate the area which is undulating, but it's more or less sort of flat, into two valleys: the South Valley here and the North Valley here. And over here you have some heights called the Fedyukin Heights. This is the Chernaya River, and the Russian army was outside of Sevastopol, and it was also being reinforced by other units being brought in from the Ukraine and southern Russia and so on. So it was a strengthened Russian army from the one that had been defeated at the Battle of the Alma, which was accumulating up. Sorry, I've zoomed out too much now. Which was accumulating up around here somewhere. And essentially, the British, the Balaclava was a really unsuitable narrow harbour for the army to be supplied from. But this was the main kind of area of vulnerability from the point of view of the Allies besieging Sevastopol, that an army could sweep down here and cut off the supply of the army by breaking this line of communication across this way. So as a kind of outer perimeter of defence, the Allies had, or the British rather, had constructed and were constructing 6 redoubts which were on the Causeway Heights. Redoubt number 1 was on a hill here, which is known as Canrobes Hill. Canrobes was one of the French generals. So you've got 1 here, and then 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. And 5 and 6 were still unfinished. But even these other redoubts here, which were technically finished, were really unsuitable as redoubts. They were on very kind of hard ground, which had been difficult to dig and excavate. So the ditch and the ramparts of them were very shallow indeed, and didn't afford a great deal of protection. And a Russian Cossack could easily get over the ditch and rampart. They were very shallow indeed. But they were manned by Turkish forces, and because they were the first 3 redoubts at least were overrun at the very start of the battle. The Turks in the end, they were irregular forces and they were obliged to abandon them. But from the British point of view, that sort of 2-hour part of the battle was over really before the British really got sort of underway and were aware that there was a Russian attack happening. So from the British perspective, it looked as though the Turks had just immediately abandoned these very unsuitable positions. And the subsequent histories have always sort of followed the attitude of the British and French at the time, that the Turks were very kind of poor troops, when in fact they had put up the best resistance that they could in these particular redoubts. And Kershaw makes the sort of observation that really Colin Campbell, who was Sir Colin Campbell, who was responsible for the defence of the harbour itself and commanded the Highland Regiment during the sort of Thin Red Line stand on the hillock there, he was well aware of the nature of the Turkish force, that they were irregulars. Campbell was an experienced military commander. He had experience fighting in India and so on, and he knew how to handle and what the Turks were actually capable of doing, and had really kind of put them there as a tripwire So he didn't anticipate that they would, be able to hold out indefinitely in these redoubts, and quite expected them to give way after a kind of limited resistance. And by that time, his plan was to have brought the Highland Regiment and so on that he commanded, and he also had some Marines up here on the hill, to bring them to form some kind of line of resistance to any attack, whilst reinforcements were brought down from the plateau up here, down into the valley, in order to reinforce him. So that was the idea. But the Turks have always, or up until sort of recently, have always been portrayed as very kind of cowardly, fighters, and they certainly weren't. They were in an impossible position, and recognised that they were, the sort of the sacrifice that was being made, and did do a reasonable job of holding the Russian advance up for probably about 2 hours. So that's kind of another thing that Kershaw kind of brings, that is not new, but it is sort of fairly fresh to the story of the Battle of Balaclava. I was going to say something else about... Yeah, I will talk about this now. One of the things about this map, which I don't think is quite right, and I'm surprised that it's not on this map, because at the end of the story, Kershaw, again, it's not a new point, but it is reasonably new, a reasonably modern kind of take on the Battle of Balaclava, is that the Russians ended up holding on to to redoubts numbers 1, 2 and 3, and that gave them control over the winter of this road, basically, which was a metalled road, which was the best way of getting supplies from Balaclava into Sevastopol, into the siege lines around Sevastopol. And yet on this map you can see that there isn't a direct road, or there doesn't appear to be a road leading from Balaclava up onto the Causeway Heights and that way. And the route that the supplies from then on had to take to the siege lines was on this road here, which goes through the village of Kadikoy, which there's a typo there. He's actually got it as Kadikos. I'm going to talk a bit more about typos later. But this is the really appalling route that the British had to use to get supplies up to the siege lines, and it became a quagmire with constant use, and in the really bad weather it just became an almost impassable quagmire. But you'll notice, if I show you another map, which is in Mark Adkins' book, right, so this is a slightly different angle to the map in Kershaw's book, but this is Balaclava Harbour here. This is the village of Kadikoy with the road going through and over a coal on this is a very sort of steep escarpment here, or the Sapoon Heights, with the British Army up here. This is the route that the British then had to use after the Battle of Balaclava to get their supplies up onto the plateau. But you'll see here that he's got a second road leading out of Balaclava, going up onto the Causeway Heights, and then going on to Simferopol, which is the capital, as I said earlier, of the Crimea. And this is the route that, and before, prior to the Battle of Balaclava, the British were using to get their supplies up onto the siege, up to the besiegers. And this is the main road. This is the metalled road with a really good surface. So one consequence of the Battle of Balaclava was that it really did restrict how much supplies the British could get to their siege lines. So from at that point of view, the Russians actually won a sort of tactical victory at Balaclava. But as you can see on here, on none of Kershaw's maps, and on a lot of maps in history books of the Crimean War, you don't see that main road depicted because it ceased to be used. It's just not in a lot of history books, including Kershaw's. Even though, at the end of the story, he does make this point about the problems the British had after the Battle of Balaclava in supplying their troops. So I found that interesting. Yeah, in terms of, I mean, he's got a lot of. There's been a lot of controversy over the battle and a lot of different opinions about the capabilities of various people. But like most historians, Kershaw has a lot of time for Colin Campbell. He was a very experienced militarily experienced general. He made a lot of wise choices and so on, was able to think independently and adapt to the circumstances on the ground. So he follows in the sort of tradition of most other historians in terms of respecting the stand of the 93rd Highlanders, who, rather than form up in square when they saw this mass of cavalry coming down from the heights, to threaten Balaclava, the idea was that they were going to go into Kadikoy and destroy the artillery parks and so on, and then possibly even get into Balaclava itself and destroy the town. But with the few forces that he had, Campbell was able to hold the cavalry charge off, and rather than form the Highlanders into square to receive the cavalry charge, he actually stretched them out so that all their guns could bear on the Russian attackers, and kept them in a line. And it actually was sufficient, particularly as some of the retreating Turks did turn and support one of the flanks, again, which is often not mentioned in accounts. And he also got a lot of invalided soldiers out of the hospital in Balaclava to shore up the other flank, and it was just sufficient to break that attack. But then he's also got a lot of time for Scarlett, the commander of the Heavy Brigade, and his cool thinking, because Scarlett Luke and the overall cavalry commander had dithered a little bit and had been moving the cavalry backwards and forwards up this position here, and he'd originally positioned them so close to the Russian guns here that they were taking unnecessary casualties from the Russian gunfire, so he moved them back. And then when Campbell was threatened, he then ordered them back again, and they were in the process of going that way when they spotted, literally about 80 yards over the crest of the hill, the pennants of a lot of Russian lancers threatening their flank. So Scarlett was able to take his time and turn the brigade to face this Russian threat, and the Russians equally, rather than charge pell-mell into the flank of the British Heavy Brigade, actually also decided to sort of dress their ranks. So there was a sort of long, anxious period when the Heavy Brigade were in a lot of danger, but then they were able to as I say, the expression is charge, but they were barely within sufficient distance to get up to charge pace, but they had to attack the Russians, uphill, massively outnumbered, and were able to, just by their sheer weight, the superiority of their mounts, and the sort of Russian indecision, to go right through. They were enveloped by the Russian cavalry. It was such a large body, but they were able to cut their way right through. And the Russian cavalry then fell back in disorder, back up to the end of the North Valley here. So the valley, there's a North Valley and a South Valley, I think I told you that, separated by the Causeway Heights. So they then went back up here in disorder. And at that point, the Light Brigade, commanded by Cardigan, was in a perfect position to actually pursue them, attack them while they were in disorder, and pursue them completely, rout them. But Cardigan refused to move. Unlike Scarlett and Campbell, who were sort of thought more independently, Cardigan had been ordered by Lucan to remain where he was, and he steadfastly, despite some of his subordinates urging him to attack the Russians, steadfastly ignored them and allowed them to withdraw, and that actually had consequences later in the day for his brigade. But yeah, so while I'm on this subject of the sort of chain of command and so on, Raglan was up here on the Sapoon Heights, and Kershaw makes these really good observations, having stood on the same spot himself, that it was a good half hour. It took a good half hour for an order from Raglan to get down to his subordinate generals in the valley below. And also, Raglan had what Kershaw describes as a three-dimensional view of the battlefield, which the commanders lower down didn't. So he was able to observe things happening that the generals down on the valley floor couldn't see and couldn't be aware of. But it's really that critical time gap that means Raglan was issuing all these really kind of imprecise and unclear orders, which his subordinate generals had difficulty understanding, and if they were to question the orders, it would take another half an hour for the runner or the ADC, whoever was bearing the orders, to go back and get things clarified by Raglan, and then another half hour for it to go back. And in that time, lots of opportunities, the battle was far more fast moving than that, and opportunities would be lost and crises would have come and gone. But that was a kind of key element to this battle. It was that the distance and the difficulty of transmitting orders, and when they were transmitted, Raglan wrote them in a really appalling manner that just led to more and more problems. So Kershaw puts a lot of blame for the errors that were to happen. All the successes he attributes to the generals on the ground, to Campbell and to Scarlett, but the errors, the charge of the Light Brigade later, he certainly lays at the feet of Raglan, Lucan and Cardigan, who were all very inflexible, unable to sort of think on their feet kind of generals. And the other thing, while we're talking about distances and time factors here, is that Raglan had ordered 2 divisions of the infantry to leave the siege lines and come down to reinforce Campbell and so on. But in earlier nights prior to the battle, there'd been a lot of false alarms where the infantry had indeed been called down to counter Russian threats that didn't transpire. And it took 2 hours on that occasion for these 2 divisions to actually appear on the battlefield. And Cathcart's division here was very tardy in setting off anyway, because his men had only just left the siege lines overnight. He insisted on allowing them time to have breakfast and so on. So they were 40 minutes behind the division of the Duke of Cambridge. But even Cambridge's division didn't really get to the battlefield until it was virtually all over. And that was partly as a result of these sort of false alarms that had happened earlier, but also a factor of the distance and so on, that Cathcart in particular just thought, oh, it's another false alarm, and didn't hurry himself. But it wasn't. There were really barely sufficient troops guarding Balaclava. So if the Russians had been a little bit more assertive and aggressive, they could easily have won the Battle of Balaclava and forced the British, to abandon the port completely, and it could have been the turning point of the war. So from Kershaw's sort of first-hand experience of standing on these heights and looking at the distances and so on, he is able to kind of contribute quite a lot of fresh knowledge about the battle, I would say. So it's really worth reading from that point of view. I would say, though, that there are a number of... I mean, I was reading things and thinking, I'm sure that's not right, and thinking I must go back and check that later, and then not doing so. But there are certainly a few typos, and there are certainly some errors in this book. This is a map showing the charge of the Heavy Brigade. I'm not going to go into it. Oh yeah, one thing maybe I would say is, which I've always sort of been aware of this. The descriptions of the battle always break it into these three sections of the Thin Red Line, the charge of the Heavy Brigade, and then the charge of the Light Brigade up the North Valley. But in fact, you can see on this map that the cavalry that threatened the 93rd was the same body of cavalry that also was countered by the charge of the Heavy Brigade. And in Kershaw's book, he actually places the charge of the Heavy Brigade, he describes the charge of the Heavy Brigade before he gets on to describing the stand of the Thin Red Line. And the reason for that is that they were almost sort of almost simultaneous. That the 93rd stand had deflected a portion of this cavalry, and they'd gone off. I think they went off that way. But it's the same body, and so there is no real reason why you shouldn't describe the charge of the Heavy Brigade first, which is what Kershaw actually does. I was going to show you, if I just zoom in a little bit, there are sort of some niggly kind of typos and things like that. So he talks a lot in the book because there's a lot of surviving accounts that he uses, and one of them is from a sergeant in the infantry who was in the division that the Duke of Cambridge brought down this road here, and positioned at the top of the Sapoon Heights, and they got there in time to witness the charge of the Light Brigade, but not to actually take part in the battle. But one of the accounts is from a sergeant who was Timothy Gowing, and you can see on here, I think you can, I hope it's focused well enough, that he's typed in there as Sergeant Timothy Crowing. So it hasn't necessarily been proofread. entirely satisfactory. But there is also, in the photographs, he's got a lot of, the photographs again. Yeah, here we go. In the photograph section, he does use some stills from the 1968 film of the Charge of the Light Brigade, which was historically quite inaccurate, but nevertheless it's a splendid film, and as he puts in here, this is one of the scenes. So the scene encapsulated in Tony Richardson's 1968 film The Charge of the Light Brigade, and it does capture what the visual impression of the charge must have been like. So he mentions it there, and he's got another one here. Both of them showing. This is another still from Tony Richardson's film, Author's Collection. So both of them show the troops, the Lancers, which don't feature very highly in the film. I thought there's far more attention paid to the 11th Hussars, which was Cardigan's regiment. But so he mentions the 1968 Tony Richardson film, and yet in the text, I have marked it so that I can find it, and then inevitably, yeah, in the text here, he's got this section here. A myth has since grown around an apparently impetuous Nolan. Ah, yeah, I will talk about that in a minute. Fueled by Hollywood characterizations played by screen icons such as Errol Flynn in the 1930s and Terence Stamp's portrayal in the 1970s in epic film recreations of the Charge of the Light Brigade. Now, what he's referring to there is the Tony Richardson film, which, as he himself has pointed out in the photograph captions, was made in 1968, not the 1970s. But this is definitely wrong. He talks about Nolan being portrayed by Terence Stamp, the famous actor Terence Stamp. He wasn't. He was portrayed by David Hemmings. So that is one very clear kind of error that hasn't been corrected, even though he had the date right himself in other dates. But definitely Terence Stamp wasn't in any film, as far as I know, depicting the Charge of the Light Brigade, and it was David Hemmings in the 1968 film. So I think there were, as I say, I haven't been able to find them when I've gone through the book again, trying to mark some pages to show you. But there are a couple of times when I thought, is that right? Has he got that that person right, or that date right? Or he even depicts some of the uniforms and so on. Talks about their colourings and things, and I thought, I'm sure it was different colour from that, but I've missed out on this. But I think there are some corrections that need to be made in this book, so maybe the next edition they'll be put right. But yeah, on this matter, let's get on to the Charge of the Light Brigade itself, because that does inevitably take up a large portion of this book. He pays more attention to the Charge of the Light Brigade than to the other two main elements of the Battle of Balaclava, and quite rightly so. And he has got some fantastic written descriptions of the battle and the experiences of the individuals and so on. It's really worth reading. This book is really worth reading for that alone. But he does have to deal with the controversy of who was actually responsible for the charge taking place, because in more recent years a lot of the blame has been put onto Nolan himself. Now, Nolan was an ADC in Raglan's sort of entourage, who delivered the final very kind of badly written order from Raglan down to Lord Lucan. Raglan was concerned that he could see from his height advantage here he could see the Russians beginning to withdraw captured guns from these three redoubts. Now, the guns, by the way, weren't manned by Turks. They were actually, well, at least in terms of officers, had British officers commanding them. So I've never found, I didn't know that, and I've never heard of any accounts of those British officers. What happened to them? Were they killed, in the attack, or did they flee with the Turks? It would be interesting to find out that kind of aspect of the story of the battle, but I've never come across it anyway. But anyway, Raglan could see these three redoubts were being the Russians were bringing up horses to pull the guns, capture the guns, to withdraw the guns behind their own lines, and that was a great disgrace to any army, because guns don't have standards to rally around. Artillery units don't have standards. The guns themselves are regarded as the regiment's standard, and they should never be surrendered or captured. So he was intent on doing something about that, but had this problem, as I said earlier, of there being a half-hour delay, in the communication of any orders that he sent down to the valley. So Nolan was the person that dispatched this final order to try and prevent the enemy from taking away the guns. It's often been suggested of late, in the last sort of several decades, that Nolan was a very experienced cavalry commander who had written a couple of texts on cavalry tactics, and was actually of the opinion that it was possible for cavalry to capture artillery batteries without any infantry support or artillery support, to do it independently. And it's often been suggested that because Nolan had been frustrated with Raglan's over careful attitude in the way he used his cavalry earlier in the Battle of the Alma and the Battle of Bolganak and so on, earlier in the war, that Nolan was determined that the cavalry were going to be used, and used as he saw it properly. So when he delivered this letter down to Lucan, they couldn't, from the valley floor, they couldn't see what was going on in these redoubts, because it was above them and out of sight. But they could see these guns that had been a Don battery of guns that had been placed along the head of the valley, head of the North Valley. And it's often been suggested that Nolan deliberately pointed to these guns as being the objective of Raglan's order, knowing that that he really intended Lucan to stop the British guns from being taken away, and that it was Nolan who was responsible for misleading Lucan. But Kershaw doesn't have any of that. He says that basically what happened was that Nolan had been impressed by another ADC called, I think he was called Hardinge, who had been able to take part in the charge of the Heavy Brigade. He had sent an order down to Scarlett and then asked permission to join in that charge, which was a fantastic, remarkable success. And then Hardingen had returned all sort of bloodied and clothes tattered and battle scars all over him, to kind of got back up to Raglan's position up on the heights, and had been showered with praise and congratulations and so on, of having had the opportunity to take part in this glorious kind of attack. And that had been principally on Nolan's mind as he went down to give this order to Lucan, and his main aspiration was to ask permission to take part in the Light Brigade's action and to cover himself with glory, an equal glory to that which Hardinge had done. But it was never his intention to charge, even though he had commented in some of his earlier attacks that it was possible to do it. It had never been his intention to order the Light Brigade down this valley, because it was quite apparent that the valley was flanked by Russian artillery here and in the Fiducian Heights and also on the Causeway Heights, and it was going to be a suicidal charge. So, but what happened was, as Nolan descended down this very difficult 600-foot drop escarpment, he, like Lucan, he was taking the order to, lost sight of these batteries, and it wasn't at all in a kind of argumentative or insolent mood, but he was excited about the prospect of taking part in a charge, and he pointed very kind of casually in this direction, and all that Lucan could see was the guns of the Don artillery, the Don battery at the end of the valley. And then, of course, as they say, the rest is history, that when the charge, Lucan passed on the command to Cardigan to make the charge against this battery. And because Cardigan and Lucan were on such bad terms, they were brothers-in-law, and they had a very kind of strained relationship. They hated one another. Cardigan wasn't prepared to question the order, and Lucan wasn't able to question the order because it was down to Nolan to explain the order, because he had been present when Raglan made it, and there was there would have been a half an hour delay in order for Lucan to send for further clarification. Well, indeed, an hour's delay, so it's half an hour each way. So Lucan, unlike the other two commanders, Campbell and Scarlett, just sort of mechanically ordered Cardigan down the valley. And then when the charge began to take place, Nolan realised that they were going in the wrong direction, and that was when he made this famous kind of rush to get ahead of the brigade, get ahead of Cardigan, and try and divert the attack up onto the heights. And that was when he was the first casualty. A shell burst over him and he was killed. So Kershaw kind of exonerates Nolan of any blame. Says that he was a professional soldier and wouldn't have been insolent, wouldn't have been overexcited and heated, other than this element that he really wanted his share of the glory of the day, and wanted to see some action. But it was never his intention to attack the guns. So that's Kershaw's take on it. And while we're on this thing about the personalities and so on, Kershaw's quite hard on Cardigan. He takes the view that Cardigan was really impressive in my point of view, my take on it, in that he was able to kind of keep the Light Brigade advancing at a very kind of steady canter and trot to begin with, rather than going to a gallop, because it's about 1.5 miles down this valley, despite all the kind of the galling fire from both flanks, and then survive the final kind of rounds of canister and grape shot that came out. And he survived. He maintained a kind of parade ground discipline all the way down the valley. Got behind the Russian guns, but then Kershaw's not impressed by that. He says that he was doing it very kind of robotically, was obviously very physically brave, but wasn't kind of mentally coping with the situation. And then, you know, sort of joins in this sort of dismissive attitude of what Cardigan did after the guns had been reached, because Cardigan then takes no further part in the action, and in fact was one of the first people to get back. So, you know, whether he was kind of traumatized by the events, but he certainly didn't do any fighting when he got there, unlike a lot of the other officers and men who did, you know, get into action there, because that was when this cavalry that had you know, retreated in disorder down here had reformed by that point, and they were able to chase the survivors of the charge down. A couple of things that I did sort of notice that had never occurred to me before. Kershaw says that I mean, obviously the Light Brigade was kind of finished after the Battle of Balaclava. It wasn't really able to contribute to the war after the Battle of Balaclava in any significant form. But he does point out that 75%, there were something like 664 people who took part in the charge. 75% of them either survived the charge or recovered from their wounds in order to be able to rejoin their regiments. So from the point of view of the riders, yeah, I mean, 25% casualties is bad enough, but it wasn't the kind of complete massacre that you might think. But it was the horses that suffered the most. 56% of the brigade's horses were killed or destroyed, and the remainder then kind of perished in the winter, which kind of the brigade was moved up onto the heights about a week after the battle, so their camp was put up on this really kind of exposed position, and most of the rest of the remaining horses perished during that winter. So it was really the loss of horses, the loss of mounts, rather than of personnel, which did for the Light Brigade during the charge. And oh yeah, another quite amusing statistic that he, you know, I thought was an interesting one was that the Light Brigade did have kind of reunions, which began, I think the first one was about 21 years after the battle, and more than double the number of survivors actually turned up at the reunion. So there were a lot of people, you know, who claimed to have taken part in the charge who actually didn't, because more than double the actual number of survivors appeared for the first reunion. So lots of interesting little snippets like that. I think that is more or less. I would really recommend this book. I really enjoyed reading it. Despite the mistakes and things in it are just niggardly, really. They're nothing substantial. Some of these photographs are unknown to me. Some were actually taken by the author during his visit to the Crimea, so they are interesting. Some of them are your kind of bog standard. I mean, that picture of Raglan's famous in the Library of Congress. That's Paget, who was in the 4th Light Dragoons. But I like some of these ones of the present day battlefield. Yeah, but oh yeah, this is another good map. I didn't show you this. This is the actual charge of the Light Brigade. So it's got a very, it's broken down by minutes. There's only sort of 7 minutes to get down the valley, but it's broken down into where the brigade was at each minute, and the number of rounds that could be fired from each battery into their flanks or into their front and so on. So I quite like that one. So it's got a lot of useful maps like that, but it's a great shame that it doesn't list them at the beginning of the book, allow you to find them more easily. But anyway, there we go. Robert Kershaw, 24 Hours at Balaclava. I can highly recommend it, and thanks for listening. Bye for now.